When I analyze the strategic behavior of Russia and China, what strikes me most isn't their similarities as authoritarian powers or their shared opposition to American hegemony. What fascinates me is how their psychology as continental empires shapes everything from their domestic governance to their international relations in ways that maritime powers like Britain or the United States simply don't understand. You see continental empires think about security, territory, and power in fundamentally different ways than maritime empires do. And understanding this difference is crucial to predicting how Russia and China will behave in the coming decades, because their imperial psychology drives their strategic choices in ways that often seem irrational to observers who think in maritime terms. Let me start with the basic geographical reality that shapes continental empire psychology. When you're a continental power, your borders are lines on a map surrounded by other land powers who can march armies directly to your territory. You can't retreat behind oceans when things go wrong. You can't rely on naval superiority to protect your homeland while you project power globally. Your security depends on controlling land, and the more land you control, the more secure you feel. This creates what I call the continental security paradox. The more territory you control, the more territory you need to control to feel secure. Every new acquisition creates new borders that need to be defended, new neighbors who might become threats, new populations who might rebel or collaborate with enemies. The logic of continental empire is always expansionist because standing still feels like falling behind. But here's where Russia and China differ in fascinating ways, despite sharing this basic continental psychology. Russia's approach to empire has always been more purely territorial. Russian imperial identity is fundamentally about vast territorial extent and the ability to run roughshod over others. When Russians measure their country's greatness, they think in terms of square kilometers and the number of time zones they span. More territory equals more security equals more power. China's approach is more sophisticated and more dangerous. Chinese imperial psychology isn't just about controlling territory, it's about controlling civilization itself. The traditional Chinese view held that there was only one real civilization, theirs, based on Confucianism, and that civilization constituted a world order unto itself. Everyone else was barbarian by definition, and the proper relationship between Chinese civilization and barbarians was tributary submission. This difference in imperial psychology helps explain why Russian expansion tends to be more obviously aggressive and territorial, while Chinese expansion tends to be more subtle and civilizational. When Russia wants to control a territory, it simply takes it. Crimea, parts of Georgia, eastern Ukraine. The approach is direct, violent, and obvious. When China wants to control a territory, it tries to make that control seem natural and inevitable by demonstrating Chinese civilizational superiority. Look at how differently Russia and China approach their restive minorities. Russia's method is brutal but straightforward: suppress, relocate, overwhelm with Russian settlers, and eliminate alternative identities. The approach in Chechnya was to level the capital and turn most of the territory into an environmental wasteland until resistance became impossible. China's approach to minorities is more systematic and more chilling. The genocide of the Uyghurs isn't just about suppressing separatism, it's about eliminating the possibility that non Han peoples could maintain distinct identities within the Chinese empire. The surveillance state, the re education camps, the forced sterilizations, all of this represents a much more complete project of civilizational absorption than anything Russia has attempted. This reflects a deeper difference in how these two continental empires think about identity and assimilation. Russian Empire has always been relatively content with ethnic diversity as long as that diversity doesn't threaten Russian political control. You can be Tatar or Ukrainian or Georgian within the Russian Empire as long as you accept Russian political dominance. China's approach is more totalizing. To be truly Chinese, you must be Han, or you must be so thoroughly assimilated that your non Han identity becomes meaningless. But perhaps the most important difference between Russian and Chinese continental psychology relates to how they think about time and historical inevitability. Russian imperial psychology is deeply shaped by trauma. The Mongol yoke, the devastation of repeated invasions, the constant fear that other powers will dismember their empire and subjugate their people. Russian expansion is driven by fear, by the belief that if Russia doesn't control its neighbors will eventually destroy Russia. Chinese imperial psychology operates on much longer time horizons and with much greater confidence in ultimate Chinese success. Where Russian expansion feels desperate and reactive, Chinese expansion feels patient and methodical. The Chinese don't need to take Taiwan tomorrow because they believe that Chinese civilizational superiority will ultimately make Taiwanese independence impossible to sustain. They can wait decades for the right moment because they think in terms of centuries. This difference in temporal psychology also shapes how these empires think about reform and adaptation. Russian continental psychology tends toward rigidity and resistance to change because any change might be interpreted as weakness that invites attack. Putin's Russia has become steadily more authoritarian and more isolated precisely because the Russian imperial mindset sees adaptation as dangerous vulnerability. Chinese continental psychology is more flexible and adaptive, but only within certain boundaries. The Chinese Communist Party can abandon communist economics while maintaining communist political control. It can embrace capitalism while rejecting democracy. It can modernize its military while maintaining traditional concepts of civilizational hierarchy. But it cannot accept political pluralism or genuine autonomy for minorities because these threaten the fundamental premise of Chinese civilizational unity. This helps explain why Western attempts to engage with these continental empires have been so frustrating and ultimately unsuccessful. Maritime powers like Britain and the United States think in terms of balance of power, spheres of influence, and negotiated settlements. These concepts make perfect sense when you're dealing with other maritime powers who can retreat to their island fortresses when things go wrong. But continental empires don't think in terms of balance of power. They think in terms of hierarchy and submission. From a Russian perspective, either Russia dominates its neighborhood or Russia gets dominated by others. There's no stable middle ground where Russia coexists as an equal with Poland or Ukraine or Georgia. From a Chinese perspective, either Chinese civilization sets the terms for East Asian international relations, or barbarian powers impose their inferior systems on the region. This is why arms control agreements and confidence building measures and diplomatic engagement tend to fail when applied to continental empires. These tools assume that the parties involved accept the legitimacy of the existing international system and want to find ways to reduce tensions within that system. But continental empires see the existing international system as illegitimate precisely because it doesn't acknowledge their rightful position atop regional hierarchies. The economic implications of continental empire psychology are equally important. Maritime empires tend to think in terms of trade and comparative advantage. They want to create wealth through exchange and specialization. Continental empires think in terms of extraction and control. They want to create wealth by controlling resources and labor, not by creating mutually beneficial trading relationships. This is why both Russia and China have such difficulty developing normal economic relationships with their neighbors. Russia's approach to economic relationships is essentially extractive: sell energy and raw materials, buy manufactured goods, use energy exports as political weapons when convenient. China's approach is more sophisticated but equally hierarchical. Chinese companies and Chinese workers and Chinese technology will modernize your country in exchange for access to your resources and markets, but the relationship will always be structured to benefit Chinese interests first. Neither approach creates the kind of interdependence that makes war less likely or generates genuine prosperity for all parties involved. Instead, both approaches create dependencies that can be weaponized when political conflicts arise. But here's what I find most concerning about the psychology of these continental empires. They're both operating with outdated assumptions about how power works in the modern world. Russian imperial psychology assumes that controlling territory automatically translates into power and security. Chinese imperial psychology assumes that civilizational superiority automatically translates into political dominance. Both assumptions made sense in earlier historical periods when geography was destiny and cultural unity was essential for political cohesion. But in a world of nuclear weapons, global financial networks, and technological interdependence, the old logic of continental empire becomes counterproductive and dangerous. Russia's territorial obsessions have left it with enormous overhead costs, hostile neighbors, and an economy that can't compete globally. China's civilizational obsessions have created domestic repression that stifles innovation and international aggression that's driving its neighbors into defensive coalitions. The tragedy is that both Russia and China could be much more powerful and much more secure if they could abandon their continental empire psychology and think like modern nation states. But that would require abandoning the fundamental assumptions about identity, security, and legitimacy that have shaped their political cultures for centuries. The question for the rest of us is whether the international system can contain the destructive effects of continental empire psychology long enough for these powers to adapt to modern realities. Because if they can't adapt, the collision between continental empire psychology and modern geopolitical realities is going to create catastrophic conflicts that could define the next century of international relations.